Welcome back to the Keizer Report. I'm Max Keizer. Cuba. Yeah. Cigars, rum, education. I would like to welcome my guest. This is Vito Echevarria from Cuba Ventures Corp. It's listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. We're going to be talking about Cuba. Vito, welcome.
Pleasure.
All right, so Cuba is a fantastically interesting spot. It's got a huge history with America, politically speaking. And then suddenly under the Obama administration, it's been opened up or trying to be opened up. It looked like there was going to relax sanctions.
Right.
And there was going to be a great boom. Folks are real curious about it. You know, you had the Buena Vista Social Club. You know, it was huge. And, you know, all that great music. And what's happening?
Well, I mean, you have a situation right now where Obama's relaxed restrictions on tourism mainly, or I should say travel mainly, and also trade as well. So what's happening is that he's created a bureaucratic listing of 12 categories in which people, American citizens, can travel to Cuba for the first time legally. However, it does not include tourism. People can go there for so-called educational purposes, cultural purposes, journalism, professional research, that sort of thing. For the time being, the broadest category for travel is what they call people-to-people, also support for the Cuban people. All that really means is that people that go to Cuba from the United States can show that they're spending money with the locals. That ranges from taking taxi rides to the so-called bed and breakfast units, which you know as paladares in Spanish. There's a terminology known as casa particulares, which are basically bed and breakfast units. So if travelers can show that they're spending the money that way, they're basically compliant with OFAC regulations that legalizes their presence in Cuba and also legalizes the spending of U.S. dollars in Cuba, which is very important. Because otherwise, whoever goes there could eventually get into some problems with the Treasury Department over their presence there.
All right, so the Cuban government is good with this, right? Their Castro is no longer in power.
Right.
And they have kind of come around to thinking that, okay, we're going to get more tourists in here. We're happy with all this. And so America is an entrepreneurial country. They have big hotel chains.
Yeah.
They looking like a big moneymaker there. What's with the Americans? Because under Trump now, they're revisiting the old past. They're revisiting the sanctions. They're trying to go backward. Is that true? What's going on?
There's talk about it. I mean, what you have right now is a situation where the Cuban government is reaping in the bonanza of Obama's rapprochement, if you will, with Cuba. Last year, Cuba attracted 4 million tourists, which is a record for that country. And it includes...
What's the population of Cuba?
11 million, basically. And so obviously, tourism has become the main economy right now. It is no longer a sugar-based economy anymore. The ripple effect of the tourism economy, obviously, is that what Raul Castro did was he said, okay, we're not able to employ everybody here in Cuba. So what we're going to do is X number of individuals, we're going to get them licenses to become what they call cuentapropistas, which are basically independent business people. That ranges from being able to drive a taxi to operating a bed and breakfast unit, power dollars, you know, that sort of thing.
All right, repeat that again, because so what happened? They let these business people now kind of break free from the prevailing communist orthodoxy to, what do they call them? What?
Cuentapropistas.
Cuentapropistas.
Right.
Okay, a cuentapropista.
Self-employed.
Self-employed.
Right. Okay,
this doesn't divorce from the underlying communist manifesto, as it were.
Right.
And they can be sole proprietorships or business people.
Yeah, they're basically given a license to run their own small businesses, if you will, because once again, it's Cuban government's admission that it just cannot employ everybody, because that's the whole idea of socialism. The idea of socialism is the government's a sole employer. Not in Cuba these days. What's happened is basically the Cuban government has enabled a growing number of individuals, let's say as many as 500,000 individuals, to be able to do this. Now, obviously, those individuals in a position, if you will, to tap into the dollarized economy that you have in Cuba, because when you go into Cuba...
But hold on. So how is that playing with the population at large? So they're allowing a 500,000 of the population, of a population of 11 million.
Yeah.
So it's just under 5% of the population is now quasi-capitalist.
Pretty much.
Okay, so how's that playing politically across the spectrum?
Well, I mean, the whole thing is if you look at a typical Cuban family these days, you're going to have at least one member of that family that's involved in the dollar economy, if not more than one individual. So that individual is helping their family subsist under Cuba's current economic system. If you go to Cuba, first of all, you're going to notice there are
The economy, you're saying it's no longer a sugar economy, it's a tourist economy, but yet this tourist business is not terribly robust. So the whole economy, do we know what the GDP of Cuba is, roughly?
I don't have it in front of me, but right now the tourism is a big factor these days in the country's GDP.
Right,
Yeah.
and that supports this rationing, really,
Well,
of goods and services.
Yeah, like I was about to say, what you have in Cuba is two currencies, basically. You have the Cuban peso, which doesn't do very much. I mean, you can go into the government-run stores, but the government-run stores, the shelves are usually empty or half empty, what have you. Then you have something called the convertible peso. They call CUC, locally. That's the terminology that's used. That is artificially pegged to the U.S. dollar, believe it or not. With the CUCs, you can buy whatever you need, all your basic necessities, that sort of thing. So that's where the Cuban economy has been dollarized, basically. Everything there that matters is priced in CUCs, basically.
But is the government kind of slowly adopting a less socialist model in introducing a more capitalist model?
What it's arguing, basically, is that it's using the inflow of capitalist dollars to maintain elements of a socialist system, which is basically education and healthcare, because
it's like a mixed economy, like France. For many years, it's a mixed. It's the government is very involved.
Definitely.
Or the UK used to be this way. It's
definitely
governments are heavily owned. So they're kind of. You think, and this is a fair statement, that this current government in Cuba is looking down the road, and they see them as more of a mixed economy going forward. Okay, so that seems like Cuba is evolving.
Right.
They've got dollars. They're changing. So what's happening in America? Why is America being such a?
Well, it's not that America's being a. It's just a question in Washington in terms of how it's going to handle Cuba. Obviously, if Hillary.
Well, what's there to handle? This is like a startup country that wants to add some dollars to the economy. What's the problem?
Right. Like I said, it's just a question of how Washington wants to handle Cuba. There's still a tugging back and forth of how to handle things with Cuba. And obviously, the bet was that Hillary was supposed to win the last election. And if Hillary was supposed to have won, the whole idea was for the new administration in Washington to move forward on this whole rapprochement with Cuba, if you will. That includes, in particular, negotiating the claims, certified claims that American corporations and individuals still have against Cuba. That totals $1.9 billion.
Those claims go back before the revolution.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so anyone who's watched the Godfather films knows that a lot of American companies are over there, rum companies, hotel companies, gambling casinos.
Hotel Riviera.
All right, so all those guys are pushed
Hotel.
out, so they still have claims, and they still want to make good on those claims. And that's kind of the nexus of these arguments, less so about fear of a socialist dictatorship. It's more like American companies want to get paid.
Exactly, yeah, because the situation is that, like I was mentioning, the total claims is $1.9 billion, but with interest, it's $8 billion. So it's an $8 billion problem that Cuba and the United States has to resolve. Obviously, Cuba has its own so-called counterclaim against the United States. This has to do with the decades of the enforcement of the embargo against Cuba.
Excuse me, but $8 billion is kind of like a Dr. Evil type number. It's a spit in the bucket. Why can't they just do a Cuba collateralized debt obligation at Goldman Sachs? They'd sell out to pension funds in 5 seconds.
Right.
And just forget about this debt, pay off the creditors, and go down to the bank and start banking huge tourist bucks. Is it financial illiteracy from the Trump White House?
Politics.
But what's the politics here?
It says one particular state of the union, it's Florida. Every 4 years, Florida becomes an issue in terms of who's running for president. So you have certain elements of the Cuban American community that pretty much held hostage this policy, saying that we want this and we want that to be done. Otherwise, there's no movement forward with Cuba, basically.
All right, so break it down. So Florida, as we know, it's a swing state, or it's a key state. it's been vital in elections, the last 2 or 3, 4 presidential elections. It's always, you know, everyone remembers the hanging chads in Florida and Roger Stone and all that stuff we're learning about. And so you got a Cuban population, Cuban-American population. Remember, they all swam there during what year was that, when the Scarface came over, Al Pacino?
Well, you're talking 1959, you know, that period.
But there was in our 70s, and they have a big...
well, you're talking about Mariel.
Yeah.
Mariel was in 1980.
Okay,
the last days of Jimmy Carter. That's Scarface, actually.
Right, the Scarface movie. That's right, that's right. So all these people came over.
Tony Montana.
Tony Montana came over in 1980.
Yeah.
And he married Michelle Pfeiffer.
Yeah.
And then he got blown away, and he had Say Hello to My Little Friend.
Right.
And that's pretty much what anyone knows about Cuba in
Right.
America, including myself. So, but nevertheless, where were we? How did I get on that tangent?
Well, I mean,
help me.
The whole situation,
I'm lost.
you know, like I said, is this whole the politics, if you will.
Oh
here
yeah, Florida, the politics,
in
right?
this country.
So break down the politics. In other words, so the Cuban American community, they are Viva America. They're like the American, emphatic, patriotic knuckleheads.
And they tend to be conservative, actually.
Conservative, right? And
staunch Republicans.
They're like, oh, you know, the dictator in Cuba, blah, blah, blah. Like they have all this legacy, nostalgia of the bad days. And they don't want Cuba to survive. They don't want to thrive. They don't want their cousins moving over and sponging on them.
Well, I mean, basically the situation is that you had this lobbying group known as the Cuban American National Foundation. During the 1980s, the head of it was Jorge Mascanosa, and he became very chummy with Ronald Reagan. Because, you know, days of Reagan was all about the Cold War, fight against communism and all that. And, you know, Mascanosa was lock and step with all that. And so, you know, the Cuba policy in those days was very strict. I mean, no dealings. They can't even talk about Cuba during the 1980s. So you had the whole Cold War factor. But then the 1990s came along, and that's changed because it's no more Soviet bloc, Russia collapsed. Cuba went under a so-called special period, if you will, during the early 90s in which the economy just collapsed. You know, you had a rise in prostitution all of a sudden. You're dealing with women with college degrees all of a sudden becoming prostitutes in order to feed their families. This was back in the early 90s. This was a serious problem in Cuba. And, you know, Cuba didn't have access to oil, didn't have access to essential goods. And, you know, by the mid-90s, you know, Fidel Castro was forced to say, okay, we're going to put in a new foreign investment law. Once that happened, basically, you know, Cuba went down the road to become a mixed economy, if you will. But in reaction to that, the staunch right-wing Miami Cubans said, you know, we still don't want to see a success, if you will, between the Cuba and the United States in terms of rapprochement, if you will, based on this whole idea of turning Cuba into a mixed economy, if you will. So, you know, like I said,
All right, they don't want to see it just out of spite or out of...
It's basically out of spite because...
Out of spite. Okay, so Marco Rubio is just a spiteful dude who shouldn't get anywhere near power. Okay, well, Vito, I think we've covered it well. I want to thank you so much for being on the Keizer Report.
All right, thank you.
All righty, thanks so much.
All right.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keizer Report with me, Max Keizer, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Vito Echevarria. He is with Cuba Ventures Corp. It's listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange if you're interested. If you want to reach us on Twitter, it's Keizer Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.